You are listening to The Diary of a Wannabe Writer, presented by Richard A. Boxshall, in which I chronicle my life and attempts to become a professional writer by, doing some writing, daily, hopefully. Hello, you are listening to The Diary of a Wannabe Writer, and what I thought I'd look at today is one of my short stories that I've written this year. I'm going to read it to you like a little audiobook. So firstly, here's a little background. In 2023, I needed a National Novel Writing Month project that wasn't that serious, that would enthuse me because I was struggling to get into the habit of writing again. So somebody suggested I do something for fun. And last year was the 60th anniversary of a TV show I really like called Doctor Who, and the 40th anniversary of a TV show I really like called The Bill. So I decided to write a series of short stories under the banner 60/40, which obviously refers to the age of both shows last year. And the idea was I would start writing a collection of crossover fan fictions, effectively, that featured characters and situations from both shows. And of course, it gives me a bit of a kind of choice. You can either tie the Doctor into a Bill storyline, or you can tie Bill characters into a Doctor Who storyline. And I've done a little bit of both. The one that actually made me think of this project was in a 1985 episode of Doctor Who called Tomb of the Cybermen. Sorry, not Tomb of the Cybermen, Attack of the Cybermen. There is a character who is a police officer, and he's undercover working with what he thinks are diamond smugglers or diamond thieves, although actually they're aliens. We won't go into that. But there's a bit where he makes a phone call to his boss, basically updating him what's going on and saying, I need some plastic explosives, blah, 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 blah. We never see the other side of that conversation. And given that it was set in 1985, I thought, wouldn't it be fun if the person on the other end of that phone call is Detective Inspector Roy Galloway, who was the detective inspector that preceded Frank Burnside on the show, before it went to the twice weekly 30-minute slot in 1980, I think it was 88. Anyway, so I kind of wrote that story and quite enjoyed it. And then I've been writing a series of them now. I've only written 5 so far. I think only 3 of them have been this year, but I've enjoyed writing them. And the one I'm going to read to you is a crossover story. So it is set in 1987. It is literally just after the 3rd series of The Bill. There's a reference in there to Sergeant Tom Penny having recently been shot. He wasn't killed, and he stayed on the show when it came back for the 4th series, which was when it went to its half-hour slot. But 1987 is also the year that the 9th Doctor and Rose visited, when Rose decided she just wanted to see what happened to her dad on the day that he died. And initially I was just going to write a story whereby it's, characters from the Bill that deal with the aftermath of Pete Tyler's death. And then I remembered what happened in the episode and the sort of weirdness of it. And I made the story a little bit more weird sci-fi. So there is a very brief cameo for some Doctor Who characters. You do get to see Rose and the 9th Doctor very briefly. You get to see Rose's mum Jackie briefly stepping out of the church carrying a baby, so technically there's 2 Rose Tylers in this. And I quite like it. I'm quite pleased with it. If you know the episode of Doctor Who well, you don't need to know what's going on in the Bill. As I say, all I've done is chosen some of my favourite characters and hopefully got their voices right. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to my short story that I wrote earlier this year called Dead Presumed Missing. Police Constable Reg Hollis was sitting in a cafe on Gatley Street, stuffing a hamburger into his mouth. He was a tall, lean man with sharp features and a reputation amongst his colleagues for procrastination. Thanks to a very busy morning, he and his beat cohort today, WPC June Ackland, had not had time for refreshments and had been permitted to eat whilst on duty. Ackland had wolfed down her salad, but Hollis wanted to savour his food, and as such was still sitting in the cafe, delicately sipping at his tea some 10 minutes after they had been scheduled to return to the beat. He glanced up at the window to see his colleague banging on it. "Get on with it, Reg! We've just had a shout!" Ackland stood impatiently at the window, scowling at him and pointing to her watch. Of medium build, in her mid-30s with short blonde hair beneath her uniform hat, she had a slightly world-weary look about her. All right, said Hollis, looking over to the person sitting on the table next to him. "Women, eh?" he said as he stood up, brushing the crumbs from his uniform and placing his helmet on top of his head. He strode across to the doors and stepped outside. "Blimey, June, can't a man eat his lunch in peace?" he admonished her. Ackland shook her head impatiently. "We've had a shout. A hit and run over on Jordan Street. It sounds serious." Hollis shook his head. "That's only a few minutes away. Couldn't it have waited until I finished my tea?" Ackland rolled her eyes and started walking. "Come off it, June," he said as he hurried to keep up with her. "I mean, did they say someone had died?" "Yes," exclaimed Ackland in frustration. "Oh, you didn't tell me that bit." Hollis looked worried and increased his pace substantially, pulling ahead of his colleague. He turned round and faced Ackland, who was now several paces behind him. "Come on, keep up." Ackland shook her head in frustration and ran forward. "And remember to write it up properly. Sergeant Cry's inspecting our notebooks later." Yeah, muttered Hollis under his breath. "So, you didn't actually see this hit and run?" Hollis was standing in front of a squat black lady of medium height. She was standing at the threshold of her house, waving her arms at him and shouting. Ackland was behind them, examining an area of the road a few metres away where the alleged hit and run had taken place. "No," said the lady. She had a strong Jamaican accent and was glaring up at him. "I explained this to the nice sergeant on the telephone. I just saw the man dead in the road." Hollis was nodding. He had his notebook in his hands and a pencil. "What's your name, madam?" "Mrs. Edwards," said the lady. Hollis scribbled the name down. "And can you tell me exactly what happened?" he asked. "I was in the living room doing my ironing," said the lady impatiently. "I heard a screech and a crash. When I looked outside, I saw a beige car driving past me very, very fast. There was a young man with red hair lying in the street next to that green car." "What green car?" Mrs. Edwards glared impatiently at him and pointed to where Ackland was standing. "That there green car." Hollis gave a confused smile. "Mrs. Edwards, there isn't a car there, green or otherwise." Mrs. Edwards took a step forward, forcing Hollis to step back into the street. "Are you going to let me finish, young man?" Hollis nodded. "I saw the young man stop breathing." "So he was dead?" "That's what I'm saying." "What did you do next?" Mrs. Edwards shook her head. "I ran into my front room and telephoned the police. When I came back, the man was gone." "And so was the car?" Mrs. Edwards shook her head emphatically. "No, the car was still there, as was the vase." Ackland had joined Hollis on the pavement outside Mrs. Edwards' home. "There's no sign of collision, no blood, no bits of damaged car, just a broken vase." "Well, he can't have died then," stated Hollis. "He must have got back into his car after you called us. Got back into his car and driven away." "No," shouted Mrs. Edwards. "I know a dead body when I see one. I can see the soul leaving the body, and I definitely saw it. He was a dead man, killed by a maniac in a beige car." "I suppose we could circulate a description," said Ackland, "in case he's out there driving whilst injured." "He ain't driving, he's dead," spat Mrs. Edwards. Hollis nodded. "What can you tell me about the man?" "He was wearing blue jeans and a white shirt," said Mrs. Edwards, "and some kind of black jacket when he died. But when I saw his soul leaving his body, it was wearing different clothes. A grey suit with a scarlet shirt and tie. Smart, like he was going to a wedding." Hollis tried not to smile as he wrote the details into his notes. "So you think his ghost was, getting married?" "Don't take the piss, young man," said Mrs. Edwards aggressively. "The spirit always wears the same clothes as the body. I have never seen that happen before." Ackland stood next to Hollis and attempted to be more placatory. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Edwards. Did you see anything else?" "The car was still there when I got back from the phone," said Mrs. Edwards angrily. "Your young colleague here thinks I'm crazy, that the man got into the car and drove away. But the man was gone when I came back. The car and the vase were still there, but the man had vanished." Mrs. Edwards had a crumpled up piece of paper in her hand. "I wrote down the registration. Green Ford Estate, registration D602PKW. The relative quiet of the neighbourhood was interrupted as an ambulance came tearing down the street. It braked sharply close to the police officers, narrowly avoiding getting a puncture from the bits of broken vase on the road. The driver jumped out. "Hit and run? We were told Jordan Road." "We just arrived," replied Ackland. "I don't think it was as serious as it seemed. The lady insists she saw a man mown down by a car, but there's nothing here. He must have driven away." "He did not drive away," yelled Mrs. Edwards. "He could not drive away. He was bloody well dead." Hollis shook his head. "Sorry, lads, false alarm." He turned back to Mrs. Edwards, who was glaring at him. "It's not that I don't believe you, madam, but there's nothing here. I will check the registration you gave us. Thank you for your time." The ambulance driver had got back into his seat and was driving away at a more sedate pace than when he had arrived. Hollis and Ackland walked over to the broken vase. "I suppose I'd better get this picked up just in case there is something in what she says." Ackland pulled a radio from her jacket and pressed the button. 643 to Sierra Oscar. "What is it, June?" came the voice of Sergeant Peters. "Nothing to report on Jordan Road. No body, no car. It's a bit odd, though. The witness swears she saw a man die. I've got an index we can check out and a description. One other thing. There's a broken vase in the road that she says was the victim's. Probably ought to pick it up just in case." "Yorkie is near you in the car," replied Peters via the radio. "I'll get him to swing by you in a minute." "Thanks, Alec. 643 out." They stood at the curb waiting for PC Smith to arrive. Mrs. Edwards stood by her front doorstep glaring at them. "And another thing," she yelled. "If you've got them there radios, why do you need a new police box?" Ackland and Hollis were able to take their next break at Sunhill Police Station. As Reg munched through another full meal, Ackland decided to pay a visit to the computer-aided dispatch room. There was a small sliding window that gave you access to the CAD duty sergeant on the right side of the main entrance, so she knocked on the glass. It opened, and the smiling, bespectacled face of Sergeant Alec Peters peered through. "Can I help you, June?" Ackland opened a handbag and pulled out the piece of paper that Mrs. Edwards had given Hollis. "That shout about that hit and run that turned out to be a false alarm this morning? Jordan Street, what about it? This is the registration of the vehicle given by the alleged victim. You couldn't run it through the computer for me, could you?" Peters nodded and reached through the window to take the paper from her hands. He drew the glass panel shut for a few moments. When it opened again, the paper had some additional writing on it. "The car belongs to a Mrs. Jacqueline Tyler. There's an address on the Powell estate. If the victim was a male, it could be her husband, Peter Tyler. I ran them both through the computer. He's got some cautions, an allegation of handling stolen goods, but it never went to trial. CPS threw it out earlier this year. Not enough evidence." Ackland rolled her eyes. "Right, do we circulate a description? Check he's okay?" Peter smiled. "I wouldn't bother, June. Mad old lady thinks she's seen his spirit leaving his body. He's obviously got up and driven away." "He could still be hurt." Peter shook his head. "Then he needs to go to hospital. We're not here to ensure people look after themselves. It's a busy Saturday out there. I will keep an eye out for any calls that come in that could be related, though. Other than that, I'd leave it." "Fair enough." Ackland smiled and nodded and started the trek across to the far side of the building to join Hollis in the canteen. After their lunch, Hollis and Ackland returned to the beat. They dealt with several minor incidents, some kids stealing sweets from a corner shop, as well as a drunk that had been chucked out of a Lamb and Flag public house that was being a nuisance in the market. He was on the verge of being arrested for his own good when his wife arrived and dragged him home, saving both of them time and effort. Nothing happened that warranted an arrest, nothing that needed them to return to the station. At just after 2 o'clock, a call came through that a car was badly parked on the pavement outside St Christopher's Parish Church, adjacent to Waterley Street. "I think you want to take a look at this one," Peters had said to Ackland over the radio. So she and Hollis had walked across the church, and there, parked diagonally, blocking the pavement and sticking out into the road, was a green Ford Estate. Hollis raised his eyebrows. "Is that our car from earlier?" He pulled out his notebook. "I guess it must be," said Ackland. Peters did hint as such. Hollis walked over to the car. Inside it was rather untidy. There were large boxes full of various items strewn across the back seat. Even the footwell on the passenger side was full of junk. Hollis frowned. "Looks like he's a bit of a Del boy," he said nonchalantly. Ackland nodded. "The car owner's husband has a record for minor misdemeanours. Nothing we need to worry about, I don't think." Hollis looked around and then smiled. "Do you reckon he's in the church?" Ackland looked at the notice board at the gateway to the building. "Could be. There's a wedding on in there at the moment." She read the names from the board. "Stuart Hoskins is marrying Sarah Clark." She paused. "I hope they'll both be very happy," she said somewhat sarcastically. Hollis grinned and walked up to the imposing double doors at the front of the church. "What are you doing?" Ackland hissed. "I'm going to go and have a word with Mr. Tyler," said Hollis. "In the middle of the wedding ceremony?" "Why not?" Ackland shook her head. "You can't do that. He's not wanted for anything. We just want to check he's okay." Hollis rolled his eyes. "So you want us to hang around outside until they come out?" Ackland looked at the schedule on the notice board. "It's not due to finish for another half hour. The wedding car's not even here. I suggest we wait on the corner over there, see if anything's going on in Waterley Street, and keep an eye out for anything here." Hollis looked annoyed. "I suppose." He rubbed his hands together and walked away from the badly parked vehicle. "It would have been fun, though." Ackland shook her head. "It would have been the talking point of their entire day." The pair walked away and headed down Waterley Street. There were several shops slightly further down, so they walked towards them. Ackland kept glancing back. She could just see the front of the church and the road around it, as well as Mr. Tyler's car. For a few moments they stood waiting. Then they interacted with a shopkeeper who wanted to complain about local hooligans that regularly robbed him, and once they'd finished the conversation, it was clear it was the occasional teenager shoplifting rather than a pre-planned gang operation that he had initially implied. They went into the shop to listen to the complaint. Hollis was soon bored and stared out of the window whilst Ackland did the actual work. He was daydreaming slightly when he saw a beige car drive past the shop at breakneck speed. It caused an old lady to jump out of the way as she tried to cross the road. She fell over, but was soon on her feet, swearing and raising her fists at the careless driver. "June, I'm just going to nip outside," said Hollis suddenly. "Well, thanks," said Ackland, talking over the animated shopkeeper who was gesticulating wildly to make his point. "Reg!" she shouted after him as he dashed through the door. "The car that just drove past. It matches the description of that vehicle that allegedly hit Mr. Tyler this morning." Ackland turned to the shopkeeper. "Sorry, this is important." She followed Hollis out of the shop. He had made sure that the old lady that had fallen was okay. She was, just extremely annoyed, and was now running down Wortley Street towards the church, his hand on top of his helmet to ensure it stayed on his head. Ackland looked to the church, but all she could see was a beige car that had stopped in the middle of the road. She looked more closely. Could she see a leg on the road poking out from behind it? Had the driver hit someone? Understanding now why Hollis was running, she broke into a trot after him. When Hollis arrived at the scene, he could see that there was indeed a man lying in the road in front of the car, which had a heavily dented bonnet. The driver was still sitting in the front seat of the vehicle, his head in his hands and rocking gently in his seat. A girl in her late teens had rushed over to the man lying on the road, holding his hand and talking to him. Hollis was about to approach them when a man in a black leather coat grabbed his arm. "Wait, give him a few moments." Hollis shook off the hand. "He might be dying." The man bellowed at him. "Stop! He is dying, and there's not a damn thing you can do to stop it. So like I said, give him a moment." "How do you know he's dying? Are you a doctor?" "Yes," was the terse response. The man lying in the street stiffened, and the girl lay his head gently down onto the tarmac. People were starting to come out of the church to see what was happening, including the bride and groom. Hollis stepped forward. "Can I ask you to all stand back, please?" A woman in a pink dress and a carnation in her hair stepped forward. "Who is that?" Hollis could see that Ackland was on her radio. "We have called an ambulance. I want everyone to wait inside." He could see the lady in the pink dress was about to break into tears, so he tried to smile reassuringly. "I'm sure everything is all right, madam. I just want to give him some air before the ambulance gets here." Ackland was now kneeling next to the body. The teen girl and the strange doctor in his black leather coat were nowhere to be seen. Ackland put a hand on the man's neck and looked across at Hollis, shaking her head. Hollis bundled the onlookers back into the church and closed the door. He moved across to the car, the body, and Ackland, looking down at the dead man. He pulled his notebook out of his pocket. "This is bloody weird, June," he said quietly. "I'm not sure his family would choose that as a way to describe it," said Ackland. She stood up and pulled off her jacket, which she placed over the man's face. "Is there any ID?" asked Hollis. Ackland shook her head. "I haven't checked. But it's him, isn't it, Hollis? It's Pete Tyler. It's the man Mrs. Edwards saw run over earlier." Hollis swallowed and nodded. "It's weirder than that, June," he said eventually. "Do you remember she said his ghost was wearing different clothes to the ones he was wearing when the car hit him?" Ackland nodded. "Do you remember what she said the ghost was wearing?" Ackland pulled out her own notebook and flicked to the page she had made the notes on earlier that day. As she read what she had written, her face turned visibly paler. She said the ghost was wearing a grey suit with a red shirt and tie. Smart, a wedding suit. She shuddered and glanced down at the clothes that the man was wearing. They were identical to the description the old lady had given them. What the hell is going on? Mrs. Edwards had a full-blown premonition by the look of it. "Bloody peculiar," said Hollis. He looked around them, and his eyes fell to the broken vase that was on the road close to the body. "Bloody hell," was all that he could think of to say. June looked at the vase, and her eyes widened. "Reg, it's a similar vase." Hollis nodded, feeling like he was in a dream. He pulled out his radio. 171 to 148. "Yorkie, do you still have the vase you collected from Jordan Road?" There was a pause, and then the broad Yorkshire accent of his colleague crackled back through the radio. "Do I ever, Reg? Not had a chance to drop it off at the nick yet. Can you bring it to the incident at Wortley Road that June just called in? Anything you say." June looked confused. "Why have you done that? It's just a coincidence." Hollis shook his head. "I don't think so. Look at the pieces, June. It's broken in exactly the same way as the other one." June looked down at the vase. "It can't be." A few moments later, a small police car pulled up. Yorkie Smith, a tall, broad officer with a moustache, stepped out of the car. "Area car will be here in a minute," he said, looking at the scene around him. He looked at June's pale face. "Everything all right, June?" Ackland looked flustered. "Not really. Can we have a look at that vase from earlier?" "Sure thing." Yorkie opened the boot of the car and pulled out a box. "Get me another box whilst you're there," said Ackland. Yorkie nodded and pulled another box from the boot. Hollis took the first box and placed it on the ground next to the broken vase. He and Ackland peered down at them, both drawing several deep breaths as they did. "See what I mean?" exclaimed Hollis. He was right. Both vases had shattered in the same way. There was a large, vaguely triangular piece from near the neck of the ornament. It had some smaller pieces knocked off from the impact, leaving a very jagged edge. Both the shard in the box and the one on the tarmac had the same jagged bits missing, the same curves and bumps and specks of paint. Every broken piece in the box was replicated by an identical piece on the ground. Even the pink ribbon, which had a pull in the fabric near the top of the bow, had the same imperfection in both. June shook her head and started collecting the pieces from the road and putting them into the second box. "This is bloody weird," was all she could say. Hollis straightened up and started writing down everything that had happened in his notebook. He looked up and could see a larger police car heading towards them, followed by an ambulance. He knelt and checked the pockets of the body. Finding a wallet, he pulled it out. At the front was a photograph of the woman from earlier in the pink dress, holding a newborn baby. Hollis shook his head. There was a business card inside, as well as some cash. Hollis pulled out the card. "Peter Allen Tyler," he read out. Ackland nodded. "Yeah, shit, isn't it?" Hollis nodded and watched as the ambulance pulled up at the curb. An hour later, at the end of the relief, Ackland and Hollis handed over their notebooks to Sergeant Robert Cryer. They went to the cloakrooms to change out of their uniforms. Cryer sat down and glanced through the books. They seemed fine, they were up to date and detailed, and he was about to rush out of the cloakrooms and return them when a detail caught his eye. He glanced at it. According to the notes, there was an enigmatic doctor at the scene of Tyler's death. But what made it stand out to him was the comment Hollis had written down from Mrs. Edwards about the police telephone box. He grabbed the pocketbook and dashed from his office towards the back corridor containing the changing rooms. He got there just as Hollis was coming out. "Hollis!" he yelled, trying to get his attention before the man left the building. Hollis groaned. "Yes, Sarge. Everything all right?" Cryer nodded. "Yes, your pocketbook is fine. But Mrs. Edwards said there was a police box. Did you check it out?" Hollis nodded. "Yes. We walked past where Mrs. Edwards alleged that it was after the death of Mr. Tyler, but there was nothing there." "You sure?" Hollis laughed. "I think I'd notice a bloody great Metropolitan Police phone box, Sarge." "I'm sure you would," said Cryer sarcastically. He handed the notebook back to Hollis. "Thanks, Reg." Hollis looked nonplussed. "You're welcome," he said. Cryer returned to the sergeant's office. Sergeant Peters was on duty in the CAD room and Sergeant Penny was still off sick recovering from his shooting. Cryer looked up and down the corridor, then opposite and into the inspector's office. Nobody seemed to be about. Cryer closed his office door behind him and went to his jacket, which was hanging on the wall. From an interior pocket, he pulled out his personal address book. Turning to the page marked to you, he started dialing a number, watching the door carefully as he did so. He waited for the call to connect. "Hello? This is Robert Cryer, former corporal in unit. Code Greyhound 45182. I have a possible code 9 to report." You have been listening to The Diary of a Wannabe Writer, presented by Richard A. Boxall. Thank you for tuning in to my random ramblings, and if you'd like to know more about me or my projects, visit my link tree at linktr.ee/Richard Wright, capital R, capital W. Thank you for listening.
Coming in January 2025, The Diary of a Wannabe Writer, Season 2.
Hello, yes, that's right. In January 2025, I will be back with another series of this mainly daily nonsense. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about what I've done writing-wise, probably make lots of excuses about why I haven't written, probably quite a few emergency podcasts as well. Not much different, to be honest, apart from the new theme tune, which is playing in the background now. I hope you like it. And also I'm going to try and set myself some targets each month. Some I'll succeed, some I'll fail, but at least I'll be giving it a go. So join me in January.